Hey, what's up guys? Today I wanted to make a build using a model that's been collecting dust in my pile of shame. It's a 1/48 scale Tamiya T55. It's a really great model actually, but today I have something a little bit more interesting planned for it. And I figure if it gets some kind of use, it's better than just sitting in a box in my closet. So to start off, it's just a typical styrofoam base that I assembled and pre-cut off screen, and I'm kind of positioning the remains of this tank. The idea around this build is a T55 that's had its turret blown off and has been reclaimed by the desert a little bit. So with my positioning set, I moved on to doing my standard basing that I do on almost all my builds, except this time I actually blended it in a blender beforehand, and it just so it would be a little bit smoother than it normally would be. To try to recreate that sand dune texture, you want it to be as smooth as possible. And to be honest, I liked it so much that I might actually end up blending it every single time I use it in the future now. And with the ground texture still wet, I embedded in some plaster rocks made from those woodland scenic rock molds. And then I move on to test fitting the T55 to then ultimately bury it in ground texture. A part of me does feel pretty bad about doing this to such a good model, but again, I feel better using it this way than letting it sit on a shelf untouched. So I went on to building up the general shapes of the sand dunes that were consuming this tank, and I made sure to leave room for underneath the turret just because the idea behind this was the desert retaking the tank, but also someone coming back and building the turret into a shelter. I just had it in my head that someone wandering by, someone lost in the desert, finding this old wreck and this old abandoned tank and just digging out the sand and crawling underneath the space to just find what shade he could. With the ground cover dry, I then moved on to applying the dirt texture. It's my typical way of doing it, just using matte Mod Podge, either watered down or straight from the pot, and then sifting on some dirt. So we're trying to go for that sand dune-like look of just these just purely smooth rolling sand dunes. So I probably could have even used like just straight grout, which is a little bit finer than my dirt. It's all about finding that just right balance of textures, because a little too coarse and it just won't look right at all. With that dry, I then moved on to applying and getting ready for the static grass. So that's going to introduce the second element to this build, which is going to be an oasis or a lagoon, and really we're just going to isolate all the static grass just to the perimeter of the oasis. And again, applying the static grass is pretty simple. You just shake the applicator just a little bit over the surface of the thin layer of Mod Podge and just coax it until you get the kind of coverage that you're looking for. But ultimately, if you want a more thorough explanation of how to apply static grass, I recommend watching my last video, as it involved way more static grass than this build does. With the static grass down, I then grabbed a paintbrush to use the bristles as like reeds or tall lengths of grass that you then just dip in some PVA glue and apply to the surface and coax them upright. And then off screen I added a few more reeds plus little rocks. And once it was all dry, I then primed it black. Why, some of you might ask? Because it matches my soul. Moving on, I needed to pick a base color for the rust effects that I want to do on this tank, and a good base coat for rust is German Gray. For the rust effects, I'm actually following Night Shift's guide on how to do rusty tracks. I figured I would just apply it to the whole vehicle because the whole thing is going to be a rusted Hulk anyways. And speaking of rust, we're going to start off by using the lightest of the range of colors we're going to end up using. I think we're going to use a total of 5, but in this case, we're going to start off with this yellowish yellow ochre, and we're just going to apply it to the surface in a wash-like consistency, and we're also going to speckle it on with a toothpick just to give it a little bit of variation and more noise and more randomness. And And the next color darker we're going to use is Orange Rust. Again, same wash-like consistency, same speckling, but this time, we're going to try to avoid completely covering up what we just previously worked on, but then again, still trying to blend here and there as well. It also helps to have a reference photo in front of you when you're doing this as well, because rust comes in so many different colors or so many different hues that you might want to stay more in the yellow side or maybe more towards the brown side. So again, having a reference is super useful. Up next, even darker still, we're going to move on to light rust. Again, same exact process as the last time, but I'm going to go a little bit more heavy on this in terms of coverage because this is kind of what I want the mid-tone to be. With the light rust down, we're now on the homeward stretch of the final two colors, the next darkest one being just plain rust. And for this color, I'm going to mainly speckle it on. I'm going to highlight or paint in some areas and just brush on some areas. But again, for the most part, this is going to be more speckling. Mainly just want to avoid covering too much of those previous layers that we worked so hard on building. And then the final color, we're going to use dark brown. And again, we're just going to lightly speckle, way more reserved than we have been in the past. Just to give a little bit more variation. And again, if your references don't have that much orange or that much yellow in it, you can totally remove a couple of these colors. You don't need to do 5. So it totally just depends on the look that you're going for. So now we're going to go on to painting the rocks. Ignore the fact that the tank is no longer painted. I went back in time and painted the rocks. Yeah, that makes sense. This first color is called Territorial Beige. It's a pretty good mid-tone for sandy desert rocks. Once it was dry, I did a couple of washes with darker browns and a little bit of reds mixed in here and there. And then sparingly did a black wash to just really bring out the details of those cracks and crevices. And with the washes done, I then went with the original color, did a quick dry brush to bring some of that mid-range back out, and then a final dry brush of I think light mocha, just to accentuate the hard raised edges. And with the rocks done, I felt really good about this project, and then everything started going off the rails. The first thing that started plaguing me on this project that made me almost want to drop it entirely was the fact that I could never settle on a color of sand that I liked. I went over this eventually about 8 to 9 times, so it's kind of why I'm just fast forwarding, because all of these colors ultimately aren't representative of what the final project looks like. It wasn't until here did I finally feel it was good enough. At the time I was happy with it, so then I moved on to painting the grass. Little did I know that I was going to end up going back and painting it a few more times. Yeah, I'm serious. I was going crazy at that point. So as I said, I moved on to painting the grass. This is just a mixture of native green and yellow green. Very similar to my last video. Again, if you want a full rundown on static grass and painting it just like this, then go check that one out. I'll put the link in the description. But for a quick rundown, it's just a simple paint the base of the grass, lighten it up as you go. I just used, I think, desert yellow, or I used dark yellow to lighten it as I went up. And then just, again, the very tip tops, the driest color you can get. And then with the grass painted, I moved on to painting the base for the oasis, just to give that implied depth. I wanted the blue to really pop in contrast with the yellows and the browns, so I picked a very, very light blue. And even though it's entirely fixable, you can see I was pretty nervous about slapping this big bright color all over it. Once I got past the nerves, I then slapped it down and used a clean wet brush to feather the edges and help blend in the banks to the deeper parts of the oasis. I then added darker blue to the overall mixture just to imply more depth, and then use that same wet brush to blend in the transition. Soon after I finished painting, I realized the bottom of the Oasis probably should have a little bit of plant life to it, just to give it something to look at so it wasn't so boring. So I grabbed some of this coarse medium green turf and just placed it directly into the wet paint. I then off screen built a dam and prepared the resin. I added a few drops of paint into it to match the same color that I painted the bottom. So once it was all dry, I poured it. And like any good resin pour, I only lost a little bit through surprise holes and leaks that I patched up and fixed. So then with the resin curing, I then applied some tissue paper tarps, just as little accents here and there on the tank, just to give it more of a lived-in feeling. And as I was doing that, I really started to think, this sand can be a different color. So I painted it again. See, I told you I painted it again. But ultimately it was the right call. I wouldn't say I'm exactly happy with it, but I'm content with it. And that's good enough for me. With me now having sworn off sand, I then painted the tarps and painted some accents on the tank to again further make it feel like it was lived in. I then zenned out and picked rocks and painted them. Again, very relaxing, you should try it. I added a campfire and painted a bucket, just again make it feel more lived in. And then I honestly felt it needed some bushes, and ultimately this brought back the project for me. I really was not happy with it until this moment. I'll link the video down below for the tutorial I used to make these bushes. They're super simple to make and they look amazing. So yeah, with the bushes in place, I then painted it black and called it good. So yeah, there it is, another one done. Definitely had a lot more ups and downs, but overall it came out pretty good and I am happy with it. If you made it this far, thank you so much. It means the world to me that you guys are interested in watching this. And secondly, I have some questions for you guys. What do you guys want to see? Do you want to see longer format videos, or would you want to see more regular, shorter length videos? Like, do you want to see the project broken up into multiple videos? Do you want to see, or do you prefer seeing the start of a project to the end of a project in one whole video? I figure since you guys are still here around this time, that you guys are the most invested, or at least most interested in what I have to make. So I think you guys deserve maybe a little bit of input in what you want to do, or what you want to see how this channel grows, because I want to grow this channel and I think you guys deserve a voice on that. So please let me know in the bottom, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.